Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On today's episode, we'll focus on the consequences of warfare, more specifically, its psychological impact on veterans who struggle to function within society upon returning to their homelands. Russian veterans from the invasion of Ukraine threatened to bring an epidemic of crime and violence back home. Russia is facing a surge in crime following the return of soldiers from the front, many of whom are responsible for war crimes and other acts of depravity. So to get right into it, let's take a look at our latest report.
In many cases, soldiers returning home from war is a reason for celebration. There is relief among the families that their sons are safe, and relief among the sons that they no longer have to be a part of war. For many of them, it is an experience that no one but fellow soldiers can understand. For Russian soldiers, however, the tale goes differently. And not just because they are the aggressor. Those who took part in the invasion of Ukraine bring back an epidemic of violence and crime, reports say. The victims of these crimes are often the spouses or partners of Russian soldiers. Hundreds of incidents have been reported in which someone, usually close to the veteran, has been hurt by them.
Wherever you walk, there's a fear that he'll jump out of nowhere. You always have the feeling that he's walking around with a knife. It's so ingrained in my head.
The Kremlin is reportedly not eager to see these soldiers return, given how it has been treating its veterans. Many of them are coerced to re-sign military contracts, and the health of veterans is not cared for in the slightest.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia had not seen a mass return home of veterans in several years. The last major example came in the wake of the Soviet-Afghan war in the 1980s.
The conflict between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan started in 1979 and lasted for close to a decade. It is to some degree considered one of the events which led to the eventual collapse of the USSR, but its impact went far further than just geopolitics and diplomacy. It also had a profound impact on Soviet society. It was one of the few wars that the Soviet Union was involved in after the Second World War and had a severe impact on its soldiers, much like the war in Ukraine has had. Since over 600,000 troops cycled through Afghanistan during the war, which the USSR started, it led to a very significant number of war veterans. The nature of the fighting in Afghanistan involved guerrilla warfare, which is an incredibly taxing form of combat. The veterans of this war were deeply harrowed by the experience. While the Russian society of today officially applauds those soldiers, the war itself at the time was not well received by the Soviet public.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. The war in Ukraine has left Russia with a volatile force, battle-hardened veterans returning home, many carrying the weight of war crimes and trauma. Their presence threatens to unleash an epidemic of violence and crime, a reality even acknowledged by pro-war nationalist circles. But the Kremlin, ever calculating, seeks to harness their brutality, not to integrate them into society, but to tighten its grip on power. Domestic voices warn of a looming rebellion, one, quote, worse than Prigozhin's, as disillusioned soldiers return, fueled by conspiracy and resentment. They claim a fifth column of traitors is working against these veterans, preventing them from becoming Russia's new elite. Figures once on the fringes of Moscow's political life now whisper in Putin's ear, shaping an ideology of ultra-nationalist revival. Their message? Blame immigrants, blame liberals, blame doctors, anyone but the state itself. Yet the Kremlin walks a tightrope. The reality of these returning soldiers is not one of disciplined political engagement, but chaos. In 3 years, veterans have killed or maimed over 750 people, most often their own loved ones. Organizing them into an effective paramilitary force would be no simple task. Strengthening radical groups risks igniting a fire that Moscow could not control. Instead of offering reintegration, the government does the opposite. Soldiers are coerced into new contracts, threatened with near-certain death in so-called meat assaults. Those who make it back find themselves abandoned, denied medical care, left homeless or politically sidelined. Even attempts to create a veteran-led political class have faltered, with many barred from office. Still, nationalists push their agenda, demanding that veterans take seats in the State Duma, that they be unleashed against perceived enemies. The Kremlin flirts with their rhetoric, knowing full well that such radicalization will only deepen the fractures within Russian society. In its desperation to maintain control, it risks fueling the very chaos it hopes to contain. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Sergei Erofeev, sociologist from the Rutgers University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, Janusz.
So do you believe that the Kremlin is really concerned about the threat which the returning veterans could possibly pose? Are they ready for this wave of soldiers who, once a ceasefire is actually put in place, will be coming home and with many experiences and problems associated with their service during the war?
You're right. The Kremlin has many concerns, and its major concern is to keep control on the entire Russian population. That's why the Kremlin started this war, not for any imperial purposes, but for the purposes of controlling the situation in the country, for Putin to stay in power. But okay. Aside from that, which is a permanent base of the whole story, let's look at these people who have been drafted, even from the Russian prisons, the inmates going to the front line and then excused after 6 months, whereas the mobilized people who haven't committed any crime continue to fight. Okay, there is various groups of people who are very likely to radically change their lives after ceasefire, or if there is a permanent solution to the war. And of course, many observers rightly point out that the scale of this return is going to be incomparable to that of Afghanistan decades ago. There are too many, not only war veterans, it's an order of magnitude or even more compared to what happened after the war in Afghanistan. But there are also real criminals, and we already see the behavior of those people returning to the Russian regions. But also some observers rightly point out that this only contributes to the further divide within the Russian society. This is the major concern of the mafia state and the mafia boss, called Vladimir Putin, to control the society by dividing it. They have created new castes. And of course, the major caste is the mafia core and those who are incorporated in the mafia rule in Russia, those who can do whatever they want. The law is always on their side, whereas the law is always oppressing those who need to be controlled better. So these people, according to some observers, are not going to infiltrate the entire country. First of all, the majority of those in the front lines now have been drafted from the most deprived regions. So they are more likely to return not to Moscow, not to St. Petersburg, but to those deprived regions which already were much poorer compared to more privileged parts of Russia. So the situation there is going to worsen further. But also what observers notice that Putin cannot just easily afford to release all these people from the front lines, or at least from what they call the new territories. So they're very likely to be busy in these new territories. Unlike some analysts, I don't believe that Putin will start a serious war against Baltics or Poland, etc. Putin simply will never have the resources for that. But Putin cannot stop this war because it's part of the major war against the Russian society. So if he stops this war, he will have to really turn against his society. In a way, he's already prepared to turn against the Russian society. And putting more pressure on those veterans coming back, committing new crimes, trying to keep them at bay. Putin will unavoidably wage a new wave of terror against any Russian people. So in order to minimize this conflict on the Russian territory, it's very likely that he will try to keep these soldiers as long as possible on the Ukrainian territory. It's going to be hard.
Does it mean that the negotiations are doomed to fail? Because clearly, from what you're saying, Putin has a serious disincentive towards ever stopping hostilities in Ukraine, because you're saying that, you know, this provides a narrative for the nation. We're threatened. The Ukrainians are our enemy. We're fighting against them. This provides also these soldiers with something to do, as you've said. So do you think that he will be actually stalling the negotiations and doing everything he can for the peace talks not to bring any results?
The war Putin started has been lasting since 2000, or to be precise, from September 1999. And this is the major conflict on the entire Eastern European space, with many complex processes going on in politics, economy, and culture. What is happening in Ukraine is part of that. And what has been happening in Russia since the apartment block bombings in Moscow and other cities in September 1999. It's another part of this huge picture. So this is a very complex war, which Putin cannot afford to stop. So he will continue this war. But what he needs is a break, because his army is exhausted. Many in the West don't realize how exhausted Putin's resources are, financially, militarily, in terms of fighting people. So all of that calls Putin to do something. Of course, he will never accept any terms which will diminish his power. And therefore, he will try to do everything to use these people to pretend that the major conflict is going on and on and on. You're absolutely right. He cannot afford to remove this element from the grand picture, the element of this grand juxtaposition of the Russia of traditional values and the spoiled, perverted West. So this is the narrative to control the Russian population. And
one of the parts of this narrative, if I may, was to actually reward the veterans. There was a special program which was intended to create a new elite, with soldiers returning from the front lines, assuming positions of power. But according to reports, this isn't really working. I mean, in the local elections, many of them have actually failed to be elected. There were apparently even cases where someone was elected but was sent back to the front line instead. This was apparently also because some of the local elites, the pre-existing ones, just didn't want to get their position changed. They didn't want to have these veterans taking their places, right, taking over. So they resisted. Do you think that this could pose a problem, because now these veterans were expecting to be rewarded, but they didn't really get those rewards?
You're absolutely right, Janusz. There are various expectations on the part of these people, not only to have a better material life, better finances after coming back to from the front lines, because they've been already spoiled by a high pace, but they also expect something in terms of respect from the society. And you're absolutely right, this is not working. We have multiple reports from all over Russia, especially from the deprived regions, which I have mentioned, that these people are not accepted by the general population, that the divide has been growing between the ordinary Russians, who realize more and more what is this war is about, and those people who have been spoiled by Putinism, by money and by indulgences of all kinds. So what they expect is not working. They are not going to become the new elite, because the war, first of all, in the first place, was started not for them, but for the old elite, for the sake of retaining the old mafia rule, a significant part of which is the bureaucracy, which is incorporated and corrupted and co-opted into the mafia rule. So it's for them that the war is running, and not for these soldiers. Of course, there is a lot of impression management trying to play a game that they're going to be the new heroes, the new managers of the country. It's not going to work. And we see very clearly how it's not working. And the other thing is that Putin doesn't have the resources. That's why he wants a ceasefire, or he wants some break, because his resources is a big problem. And as I have said before, with this situation, the only power which can help and save Putin's system, and this first of all comes in terms of financial resources, is China. And we don't know whether China will eventually very openly and massively start to supply Putin's mafia rule with huge influxes of money in order also to keep these people happy. So far, we don't see such signs. And this means a major crisis coming.
It is a very important issue. One analyst has actually suggested to the US president that he should ally himself with China instead of Russia and try to make a very different kind of calculation when it comes to global politics. But let's return to the question of the returning troops for one last issue. Post-traumatic stress disorder and also physical injuries. Is the Russian system even prepared to deal with that, with many soldiers returning as amputees and many others also suffering psychological trauma? In particular, is actually Russian culture actually prepared for that? Because we know that in our societies, a few decades ago, you didn't really talk about mental health. You just said, okay, so someone has to man up. They have to go through the problems they are facing. Right now, this is changing. But what about the Russian system? Is it actually able to provide support to people suffering from the trauma related to psychological experience of warfare?
Well, it's true that through the post-Soviet years of market economy, the various parts of Russian infrastructure have significantly improved. To start with, we finally have social sciences, although they are oppressed now and many social scientists have left the country. But it's also true that sociological services, etc., have been developing in this market environment. So in that sense, the country is much better prepared to tackle such problems than in 1945-47 or in 1988-89. So, but in many ways, the situation is going to rather resemble Stalinist times than the times of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, because Stalin simply increased repressions against the Russian people facing this wave of violence after the Second World War. And Putin also understands that, and it's easier for him to use the resources, whichever resources he has, to control his society in this way. His calculation will probably also include that unlike in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the situation in Russia is totally different. In those days, there was no private property. So those people who would come from Afghanistan and become a part of criminal new gangs, they would participate in the total remapping of the so-called socialist property. So they became a very important element of the future mafia state, as just hitmen and marksmen, those who would be the soldiers of the new economic order. Today in Russia, the situation is totally different. All the property is redistributed. There are some signs of new redistribution going on, but this is all going in favor of Putin's cronies. Some of them are new, but the majority are old. So we should understand that in order not to be afraid of the future situation too much, because this situation will require probably hiring some of these ex-soldiers to fight new property wars. But they will not be the same as the early 1990s, from which new crime could benefit. So the new crime in this situation is not going to benefit from that. It will be the old crime which has turned into the core of the mafia state. If I'm being clear, I don't know.
Sergei Erofeev was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. In his recent phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky, US President Donald Trump suggested that the US take ownership of Ukrainian power plants. Trump reportedly said that the move would serve as protection for the infrastructure.
It seems that the White House may be interested in more than just Ukraine's mineral reserves and extraction. Zelensky himself has said that he and Trump discussed the currently Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. He said he told his US counterpart that Ukraine would be ready to discuss American involvement in investing in modernizing the plant if it was returned to Kiev's control. Trump's reported proposal for US ownership of Ukraine's energy infrastructure would supposedly protect it from Russian attacks, as Moscow could be unwilling to strike it in fear of US retaliation. This comes in context of Kiev striving to gain concrete security guarantees from the United States. Zelensky wants any peace deal to include guarantees from the West to deter Russia from invading again once an agreement has been reached. Donald Trump has so far refused to commit to Ukraine's defense in such a capacity.
Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda has warned that Lithuania only has between 4 to 5 years to prepare for a possible Russian attack. The country is currently building a fully equipped and prepared national division for this eventuality.
Lithuania's current preparations are apparently part of wider fears that Russia could attack NATO countries by 2030. The country's president has warned that if sanctions on Russia were to be lifted, then Lithuania would have even less time to prepare for an attack. Additionally, Vilnius, Poland, Estonia and Latvia announced that they will be withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention, which bans the use of anti-personnel mines. This decision was made in response to the escalating threats that Russia has been throwing toward NATO's eastern flank. The country's defense ministers emphasized the need for greater border defense flexibility. Warsaw in particular also intends to return to a more extensive use of cluster munitions. All 4 countries have declared, however, that they will continue to respect humanitarian law despite the withdrawal from the treaty.
Ukraine's Air Force has said it has received an unspecified number of additional F-16 fighter jets. The aircraft was previously often described as a game-changer for Ukrainian aerial defense.
The latest delivery of the F-16s was announced by the Ukrainian president himself at an online meeting with journalists. He explained that because Russia has not seasoned its air attacks on residential areas and civilian infrastructure, F-16s play an instrumental role as a final line of air defense against Russian missiles and drones. Zelensky also debunked Russian propaganda claims that Ukrainian F-16s were shot down over the Sumy region. Kiev has not disclosed the exact number of the new F-16s, nor which country delivered them. In February, Danish officials revealed that Denmark had transferred 12 of its promised 19 F-16 fighters to Ukraine. That same month, the Netherlands had reportedly sent a second batch of the jets to support Kiev's defense efforts. The first Dutch transfer was announced and confirmed in October 2024.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.